We're going to talk about spiels, tableside, as well as trust in Michelin. And 11 Madison Park, after changing back to including meat protein on the menu, just got their first review from Infatuation, and it got a 6.2 out of 10. We're going to dive into that and so much more. This is the Repertoire Report on the Repertoire Podcast. My name is Justin Khanna. I'm here with Ray DeLucci. How are you, man?
Good, man. How are you?
Doing good. It's we've been getting a lot of both comments and support. We actually ended up on Jason's Instagram. There was a clip that got shared of us kind of giving Jason's history. If those who haven't been following along with that situation, we did a whole kind of breakdown of what I called the Noma abuse iceberg a couple weeks back. And we've been getting comments around basically, are you guys going to cover the protest that's going to be happening? It's, I think, 7 days out as of now. Jason has been sharing that he's gotten 13 million views. So that's 10 million, almost 9 million more impressions on the content that he's been making. And he's basically been nonstop on that. There's a website, there's graphics that he's sharing. And there have been a lot of other folks who have kind of chimed in with, adding other restaurants to the mix. I don't know if you've been seeing some of this stuff on social media, Ray. Jordanair is now in the conversation, a bunch of other Copenhagen places. And, similar to other comments that I've made, I think we're seeing this almost bifurcate. There's talk of abuse stuff. There's talk of unpaid labor being the smoking gun that everybody's going after. And so, as with all of the stories that we cover such a wide range of topics here on the show for you folks, because I know that there's so many different elements of the industry that you folks are a part of. I just wanted to kind of at the top of the show say, we are going to continue to cover this. I don't think it's going to be something where we are probably going to dedicate an entire show to this unless there's something that comes out that is, as industry moving. I mean, for goodness sake, Ray, this ended up on the Rate My Chives page when he was basically please catch me up on the controversy that's happening here. Is quite comical to kind of see some of that happen. So I don't know, anything else to add? We're going to cover it once we kind of get more information or as other parties share more. I don't think that we are interested in necessarily feeding the drama, so to speak. I think what we want to do is keep you folks informed, use this as a case study, and then ultimately use this as a asset that you can use to increase your performance at whatever it is that you're doing. Because that's I'm trying to bring it back to the mission here, so to speak. You have any thoughts on just updating on the Noma thing? Because we got a lot of views. I know there's a lot of new people here, just to let people know that we are not a salacious food news drama channel.
Yeah, I do think it is something, though, that is going to be, we might look back on and see this as a big turning point in the industry. It's funny, Justin and I, off record, talked about how, we were discussing, the idea of COVID and how we thought some lessons might have carried through and they didn't in terms of, employee welfare for kitchens. And so you see this and you see, I just see Jason's posts of people from all over the world talking about it. I personally have people in my life in food adjacent jobs interact with people that were directly in that situation, and it just the network of Noma somehow led this person into a friend that I have. And they met that person just out of talking about our podcast and oh, I actually worked there and I was actually one of these people. So all that to say is I think it's a very big story. I also think that we've just started the first part of it. I think once the protests happen, however Noma responds, what comes after, how they do with LA, I think there's a long story here. But I think overall, what is interesting for me is the story is getting bigger. There are a lot of people eyes on it. And I think this is going to be a test and a testament to the idea of, what is the future going to be like for restaurants? And is this a turning point?
Totally. And so second, a little housekeeping thing. If you listen to this on a podcast platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify, the giving a like and a rating, obviously I normally give that pitch, but I more or less wanted to remind you that we have a YouTube channel that we post these videos to, and we are doing a lot more YouTube content basically going forward. And so I did a test live stream yesterday. And what that is trying to lead to, what we're attempting to do basically is interact with you folks a little bit more in a live capacity on YouTube, as well as on Instagram. And so those links are going to be in the description to follow us on whichever platform you tend to spend the most time on or prefer. And basically what is going to happen on Monday is I'm going to do a deep dive on job searching. And so I have had the privilege of getting to work with a lot of you folks in getting job placements across typically fine dining places, because those are the ones that either require you to do an international move or you're, having a little bit more of a high competition in getting a role at one of those places. And I'm noticing that I have put out a bunch of free content and it is still people are feeling like they, need a little bit more support there. And so my call to action for you folks is we're going to put a YouTube community post up on YouTube on the Repertoire channel. And if you have thoughts or questions or places you're wanting to apply to, you can either send me a DM, hello@joinrepertoire.com, or send us a DM on Instagram and we can keep it anonymous if you're interested in doing that. Or like, I would really like to go work at XYZ place someday. How would you, Justin, approach going to work at a place like this? Crafting a resume, how do I find the person to contact? All of this stuff that is like really nitty gritty and can feel really intimidating and overwhelming. I kind of want to just go through it live because I think it's an interesting way to kind of like over my shoulder view how I approach some of this stuff. It's obviously no guarantees. I cannot, like fully endorse you as a candidate for the job. But as far as like from the process that I would approach some of this stuff with, and even some of the like non-technical specifics, this is like going into the restaurant and asking to do an observational stage, stuff that I've talked about before that you can use tactically. I kind of want to dive into some of that stuff. And we're going to be exploring a bunch of other topics on live streams going forward, whether that's sharpening knives together or breaking down, a piece of advice. We've even discussed kind of like deep diving subreddits and stuff like that. That's what you can kind of expect going forward on live streams. And so if you want access to that, it's going to be free. And so YouTube and Instagram is the place to go. Ray, we've got some stories we're going to kick back and forth. Do you have a preference on where we start?
Yeah, you go for it.
Okay, so I found a piece that was from Elazar Sontag. And so he is the new critic for the Washington Post. And if you remember, we covered that piece from the previous critic from the Washington Post, Tom Sietsema, both revealing his face and then announcing that he was leaving the publication. And so I was kind of saying I was going to keep an eye on the Washington Post. Obviously, it's, not quite the giving stars and, level of Michelin guide, World's 50 Best. But at the same time, it's not, like an Instagram influencer, so to speak, who's kind of sharing their thoughts here. And also with the rise of DC becoming a Michelin recognized city, it is kind of like the role has kind of changed, I can imagine, over time there. And what I've noticed, this happened with Tehal Rao when she took over, I'm almost positive, at the San Francisco Chronicle. When the critic ends up shuffling at the publication, that critic usually has this like set the tone piece. This is my expectation. This is what I'm looking for in a restaurant. These are the little details that I notice when I'm going out to eat. And this piece was like absolutely no different. And it's titled, "It's Time to Retire the Restaurant Monologue." And so there's a couple of quotes that I wanted to read for you here, Ray, and we can basically kind of like, I want to get your reaction to some of these. So, quote, "Lately, though, I have been sitting through fewer stories and more what he calls spiels. Have you dined with us before? The question has practically become a meme, and I'm often tempted to say yes to bypass the pain we must both feel as a server dutifully runs through rehearsed anecdotes for every dish, robotic explanations as why this restaurant differs from all the others, a breakdown of even the simplest menu. At a relatively casual new DC restaurant recently, the server pointed out the lime garnish on a plate of chicken wings and told me, quote, the chef recommends squeezing the lime over the chicken wings, end quote. Which is like such an eye roll, like, what do you think that lime is for? And I was kind of like struck by this because I am such an operations nerd and I want consistency and I want to kind of like bring people along for the ride, even if it's their first service job and you've never worked front of house before. And you're going to go to a table and that's a frustrating moment as a chef. I can imagine you felt this way sometimes, Ray. Like you prepare something and it just kind of gets dropped at a table, no explanation. I've certainly been to tasting menus where that's the case. And I feel so bad because it's like you're doing the chef a disjustice here where they basically have no context to what it is that's on the plate. But then I can also understand the other side of this. I think I've gone on a rant before with you don't want to overwhelm the guest with opportunities to F the dish up, so to speak. And so if you're going to, like give a bowl and there's going to be tuna and crispy shallots and nori and spicy mayo, you want it to be such that every single thing that you have put in front of that person to mix themselves at the table can be combined in the bowl. And there's no risk for that person adding a little bit too much sesame seeds or whatever it happens to be. Because that, basically puts the onus on the person. I have a friend who does a lot of food critic-y stuff here in Seattle. And he's like, the reason I go to restaurants is so that I don't have to prepare my own food. You know what I mean? And he thinks he views it as a cop-out when restaurants put the onus on him to kind of like prepare the dish for him. But that was just an interesting thing of like trying to thread this needle between over-explaining, how he calls it a spiel, and basically like, there's not a story here. This is not giving me context. This is like almost treating me like I'm naive or that I don't know what I'm doing, which can apparently is frustrating for Elazar. I'll read another quote here. Quote.
Can I just touch on that real quick?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think there's two things. It's weird that you brought this up because obviously I saw this a little bit beforehand, but I didn't like really know you were bringing this up. I've had two quick experiences. One is I've been in the position where I've taken people out to eat where I've been at a restaurant and the person has it for like 3 times in the last like week and a half. And each time the server has gone, "Have you dined here before?" And I go, "I have." They have it. And by the third time, I remember just mentally thinking, "I'm so tired of answering this question. Doesn't matter if I've dined here or not," for a simple restaurant. The second thing is, like you said, the menu explanation. I recently got engaged with my fiance. We went out to a tapas restaurant after. They were very clear that you need to order for your party size. We had like 14 people. You need to order like 12 to 14 dishes in order to, be full. I thought that was valuable information to have. When I went to this restaurant the other day, which I loved, and they're explaining their appetizers and the main course and the desserts, it's like, you don't really know that. I can read the menu. And so like there is this idea of there is a lot of this, have you been here before? And also if you actually listen to partly after that, there's like two things. It's like they either explain the restaurant, which I know that's why I'm here, or two, they don't really give you, they just go, "Oh, great." And it's like, why did you ask that question? Again, I don't think it's like a bad hospitality thing if you actually have a valuable story to tell or directive on portion sizes or whatnot. But there's just to ask if someone's been there before or not and then not have a backup, to me, is really, really like, it's not like annoying, but it's just like not needed. It's not efficient. It keeps things flowing smooth. And I used to work for a restaurant group, and they would have a very direct way of, of wait staff and even chefs approaching tables on how to direct the guests. And I just think that maybe that needs to be a little bit more streamlined sometimes. I do think that the conversations with the server are really awesome, and that's what I like. I just hate how every restaurant now is like, "Have you been here or not?" And it's like, is that necessary information for most restaurants to even need?
I can imagine that most of the reasons that these spiels get implemented as a process, meaning it is like a mandatory thing that it's expected as what's called a step of service in the restaurant. So it's the same way as, once they enter, you're kind of checking the table to see, do people have menus? Have you gotten their water preference? Has their drink order been submitted? All of these things that I think operators and especially front of house people, like, you train this so that in an effort to make sure that every single person and every single table has a consistent quote unquote experience. And more importantly, that things don't get missed. But then it's almost like these things get layered on when somebody does have a bad experience, i.e., they order 2 or 3 dishes, they get upset and leave a bad review, or have a conversation with management, call a manager over and say, "I didn't know that this was going to be XYZ price, and we were only going to get this amount of food." And then that sweeping policy kind of like affects the entire organization. And now every single person, it gets like almost like bolted on as this like appendage to the step of service. And so I'm bringing this piece up specifically for people who kind of like, you're the person who is going to set that tone and tell people what they're going to be having to spiel, quote unquote, have a conversation, verbally do behaviorally at the table. It's kind of like the trend is showing us that some of these processes, as well-intentioned as they might be, may be having a undesired effect on the guests that are coming and sitting in your restaurants. And so as with all of these things, it's not like I'm necessarily giving a prescription. I think there is a prescription later on in this piece that I'm going to touch on. It's more take a step back and ask yourself the question, are there some quote unquote like legacy conversations we're having at the table that maybe we don't need, or maybe that we tried to swing the pendulum too far the other way to prevent this bad thing from happening that happened one time, and now all of a sudden it's a process that like is actually impeding our hospitality. Quickly, another quote. Quote, "A sentiment seems to have calcified among chefs that have anything left unexplained will fly right over our heads. Maybe they're right, but I wish diners were given the chance to make small mistakes, to explore, to come to our own conclusions. In a culture of so little friction between us and everything around us, restaurants remain a vital way to experience the confusion, sensory overload, and deep meaning of a complicated, imperfect world. The urge to direct diners through every bite of a meal runs counter to what I love about dining out. One of just a few cornerstones of American life that have not yet been optimized into oblivion. Isn't this the wonder, the mystery, the chance to discover, the whole point of leaving your own kitchen?" End quote. And so that, I think, is like, for the control freak, for the person who is a heavy optimizer, for the person who wants every single person's experience to be XYZ thing, whether you label it perfect or up to par or insert your language here. I think that this is hard to hear because it's risk. You're adding risk. Like there is a non-zero probability that this person is going to have an experience that is not what you desire it to be. And that's vulnerable, right? Like that opens you up to potentially like disappointing people. And so I think it's an interesting piece coming from a critic where, Ray, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts here. Like this person goes out to eat for a living. This is somebody who is like so experienced and kind of like rolls their eyes at these spiels. But to the person who, I don't know, the couple who's been saving up to go out to a nice meal, it's like they appreciate some of that context. I just want to share a very quick anecdote before I go to my next quote. I went to a conference. I go to this conference in Boise, Idaho every year. And I'm typically like the only food chef person at this thing because it's for the email marketing platform we use at Repertoire. And so I'm amongst a bunch of other like educators and business owners and entrepreneurs and people who kind of like run marketing for a company. And they basically like it invariably comes up that I do food stuff and worked in kitchens for a long time. And everybody wants to tell me their story of a quote unquote disappointing fine dining experience that they've had. And sometimes it's the opposite. I hear like, gushing stories of, oh my God, I had this experience and it was amazing. I was just so taken aback by this person, this woman who I was sitting across from at dinner, and she was talking to me about a meal that she had. I won't name the restaurant because I don't want it to skew any sort of, do any bad, things for them because I don't think this was the restaurant's fault. She was basically like, I had no idea what the experience was going to be like. I've never done a tasting menu before. We love wine, but like I totally was overwhelmed when the som came over and was trying to like guide us through. Do we do pairings? Do we do bottles? These bottles are really expensive. And it was almost like, had that person been primed a little bit better going into this experience on what to expect at a tasting menu, especially at a 3 Michelin star restaurant, which this was, it was like, oh my goodness, that person would have, they left saying, I will never go back to this restaurant. And lo and behold, she now talks about that restaurant poorly in contexts that are like years later. And so all of like, that's the tension that I'm driving here, where it's like, if you set this as a policy, these people have to do this every day, day in and day out. And then also at the same time, some guests need that. And I think that that's kind of like how the critic here wraps things up, saying this will maybe, I want to get to the prescription part, but there was one more interesting quote that I wanted to dive into in case you don't end up reading the full article. Quote, in a world of Yelp elites and TikTokers and belly trackers, Ray, that was that app that I kind of shared with you, Belly. And yes, restaurant critics like myself, it makes sense to leave nothing open to interpretation. Only interpretation is half the fun, end quote. I thought that was an interesting way to frame it. And then lastly, he does kind of like give a little bit of a prescription here. Quote, you can have a downright chill night at Kebawa, watching undisturbed as Carmichael's team turns out a dizzying array of dishes, but express even an iota of interest in how the sausage gets made, and the nearest chef or server will click into gear, explaining the history of an ingredient. If the chef has a down moment, he might even demonstrate how your favorite bite of the night was cooked. His approach is deeply human, not a set of anecdotes and instructions to be memorized and regurgitated, but a shifting push and pull between those cooking and those eating, end quote. And I really think that's what this piece is trying to hammer on, not to really like sound like a broken record and really bring it back to the basics here or what we're all about, but it's like skill issue, bro. Like this is a ability to kind of like read the table, like interpersonal skills, the desire to kind of like make somebody's night better and actually having the knowledge of how that dish was prepared, or the ability to kind of like have that bedside manner, unreasonable hospitality that I know some people are going to roll their eyes at and say, that's not going to fly here. But I think that's kind of what you were talking about, Ray, where it's like, it's almost less interesting to have the rehearsed feeling. The reason we call it a spiel is because it feels like something that is not a genuine conversation. The push and pull isn't there. The human connection is not there. And as we talk about these like people head of in real life things, it's like, that's what we're almost trying to get away from when we go to restaurants, because all day, all of us are getting responses from large language models now. And it feels like I'm just saying this rehearsed thing that I have predictively laid out in order to make you quote unquote happy. It's like, we don't want that when we go to a restaurant. And so all of that, I think, is just a very interesting way for you to take a step back, especially if you run service operationally, and maybe have this conversation with your team and say like, hey, I think we're a little bit too robotic. I think we're a little bit too rehearsed. Let's do a role play exercise. And then you as yourself, if you're the person who is kind of sitting here and saying, man, I do that, like really take a step back and say, is there a skill that I can develop here? And, to really bring it back to the work that we're trying to do, like maybe there's a world where we can do that as a topic of a live stream. And I know that talking about food is something I'm really passionate about because I think it matters in this context, but I think it's something that's difficult to cultivate unless you get practice. And so if that would be interesting for you folks to like do a little bit of like a role play thing live for everybody to watch, I can imagine that would be an interesting live stream. I would have liked to have had that when I first started having to bring food out to tables. Any closing thoughts on that?
I'm all bought in on, especially like you said with AI and all that, to each server's unique approach. Like I think when you overscript the opening of a restaurant, you lose a key part, and this is maybe something that the customer doesn't even realize of what the restaurant experience is, and it's going out to eat. I remember when I was, living alone, it would be cool to go out to restaurants because could get to talk with a server and I'd ask questions. And, I remember I went to a restaurant, Pongal Indian Grill, and the server, the food he was serving was from his country. And we had a huge, wide-ranging discussion of what the food was about, and because I was open to that. And I don't think we would have gotten there if he was just forced to be a very scripted experience on his part. And so it's like the best experiences I've had are when servers are given a little bit of guidance, but they're actually able to have their own flair and their own ability to talk to customers.
Two things came up to really wrap this up. In the interview that I did with Chef Christian Puglisi, I kind of asked him this question around, at Relay, they were kind of one of the first restaurants in, like the finer dining side of things to have the chefs run the food. Obviously, it had happened at other places, but I kind of asked him around his process on that, or it just kind of came up as a topic of conversation. I can't remember exactly how we landed on talking about it, but he basically gave this insight on when you drop the food, say as little as you need to get the dish across, because he viewed it almost as that leaves that open interpretation element still intact, where that person can have that surprise and delight thing. I think you and I have also talked about this idea of like, you over-explain on menus, you almost add expectation to that dish, and now it turns into this problem of like, I have this state that I'm going into on having this dish, and you can almost, decrease, where my expectations are, or like land short of where my expectations are. And then he basically said, if the person asks questions, you should be not an encyclopedia of knowledge, but you should have the ability to kind of like add more context, add a story about the purveyor, really nerd out with this person, and to your point, connect with them on this thing that they're interested in. But it does not have to be a 6-minute explainer when every single dish hits the table. And I think that is similar to other points that the person brings up in this piece of like, don't treat the audience like they're stupid. That's like a common thing that comes up in like movie making. It's like between one scene and another scene, you don't always have to add all of the little details. The audience is sometimes smart enough to make that transition themselves. And then the other point that I have brought up in other pieces of content that's worth echoing here is I sometimes get frustrated I almost look at it like two people that are dating and like they're fighting all the time, but like I just want them to talk to each other. And that's sometimes how I feel about like the restaurant person and the guest. And it's kind of like the guest kind of has these desires or expectations that XYZ thing will happen, but they won't voice them. And then the restaurant has the same thing. They wish that the person would just kind of like interpret the stuff and just have surprise and delight moments, but they won't talk to them and see kind of like, what kind of night are you trying to have? How interested in food are you? Have you ever, you know what I mean? Like come to an experience like this before? Can I, give you some insights into how we do things in not a scripted way? It's just an interesting thing for you to ponder. And there's no sort of like, it is a skill. It is not a prescription that I can give you from a script perspective. And that just like re-emboldens my idea on how we approach all this stuff. What do you got?
All right. So I actually have a advice piece that I wanted to cover. This is from Kitchen Confidential Reddit. It's a longer post. I'm not going to read all of it, but I just wanted maybe not to answer their question, but a thought I had. So I'll just read you the part I want, and then we'll go from there. So chefs and owners, do you know who among your crew is going to make it as a lifer? And I think there's a little bit of a different question being asked here. But it says, quote, if so, do you do anything to nudge out the ones you know won't make it? I ask because I take it for granted that this industry tends to require sacrifices of time and opportunity. Not everyone enters the industry with a desire of becoming a chef or owner, of course. Having said that, there are sure easier ways to make money if all you need is a job. I presume most employees who stay for any length of time are trying to work their way up to chef or owner. If you knew that was a person's goal and you knew that for that person the goal was unrealistic, what would you do? For those of you on the other side of this equation, have you ever made some sort of extraordinary sacrifice for your job that didn't yield dividends in the end? Personally, I worked at jobs for a salary that amounted to half of minimum wage because I was promised a learning opportunity. They say becoming an entry-level baker. I figured that even the shitty wages and long hours were worth it, considering the alternative was paying culinary school. But in the end, it turned out that the head baker didn't want to teach me how to bake for fear of becoming replaceable. And so instead of learning the skills I'd been promised, I would end up doing mostly prep and janitorial work from filling in on the line, positions which I was well qualified for and should have been paid a competitive wage for. So from your side, have you ever made an extreme sacrifice in order to advance your career? And they go on and, there's some conversation, but I think there's two things here that when I was reading this, Justin, I had these two questions. And it's one, I think the assumption it was a little bit wrong here. I actually don't think you can always say most people in kitchens want to be head chef. We covered months ago how AI is leading people to kitchens just because they need a job. So I actually would dispute that, and I wonder your thought, A. And B, do you think this is a leadership issue when someone is at the point where they're not willing to train the next person in fear of being replaced? Because to me, that screams poor leadership, crab in the pot, environment. And so just maybe your thoughts on the A, everyone wanting to be a chef or needing to be a chef, and B, that training piece of being replaceable and not training people to get there.
I would be curious, Ray, what is the proportion of head chefs who are in positions that they're at now, who started at that restaurant and worked their way all the way up? Is it 10% of head chefs? Is it 30%? Is it 50% plus? Is it 80%? I don't know those statistics, but my gut tells me that that's not typically how somebody's career tends to pan out. I think you and I are examples of this. I know that you and I have talked to probably hundreds of other listeners at this point, where those early days of your kitchen career involve a lot of bouncing around, because it is you both need to get a wide range of skills so that you don't just become, a one-trick pony, only knowing XYZ cuisine or XYZ chef's set of skills. But then I also think that there is, to this person's post, there is a limited number of opportunities available in any one kitchen. There's 3 sous chef spots. I've certainly experienced that, where I wanted to be a sous chef at a place, but it would basically it's not a situation where if the restaurant continues to do better or you continue to be a high performer, you will be able to launch a supplementary dining room at the restaurant and you can manage it because you are skilled enough to be able to take on that workload. That's not how it works at a restaurant. And so it doesn't, mirror other companies career trajectory wise in the way that your tenure or your skill development or your, relationships you have with the ownership give you more opportunities kind of going forward.
Or in a company, you might get promoted to a title as an individual contributor. Yep. But yet again, you can't really do that at a restaurant. I had that same thing when I worked in restaurants, and we talked about this when we first met. And I was like, yeah, you kind of had a hard ceiling at a certain point in restaurants.
And so you get to that place where you're looking at the next, 3 months, 6 months, a year of what it's going to be like for you at this restaurant, and you start looking at other places. I don't think that's necessarily bad, because from making more money, getting more experience, getting the title that you want, getting to work at a certain either caliber or different style of cuisine, or insert the reason that people change jobs, I don't think any of this is bad. I do disagree with the assumption that every single person who joins an organization has this I'm gunning for the top, you know what I mean? I'm going to be the head honcho here someday type of mentality, because I think that there's so many people who work in kitchens who have roles where it's I'm just here to do my job. And I think that's totally admirable. I think there's, obviously admirable qualities, an element to if you want more, if you are a little bit ambitious, if you want to kind of get more out of that place, there's a place and space for that too. But I'm more saying that it's almost like a scarcity mindset, you know what I mean? That this person's approaching it's almost like a fear mindset. And that's what I think leads to a lot of this backstabbing behavior. I'm going to, turn off the timer on your oven so your stuff burns so that the sous chef, sees you as less than, so that I get the promotion instead of you. Because it is this when the title or the role is a scarce resource that is to be competed for, that turns into a real detrimental thing. And so I think more people, especially as we're seeing Gen Z and, get into the workforce, younger millennials too, it's almost I'm here to do this role right now. And if and when I want a sous chef opportunity, I'm gonna, maybe bring that up to my manager here. But if it's not available, like, I will go somewhere else. There's other opportunities that are available, and I think that's okay. I guess I'm more confused on the sacrifice and not having it pan out thing. It's like, that's why I think the cook to chef to entrepreneur mental model has been so useful for me, because it's almost like when you lock yourself into like, I need to be the chef at XYZ thing, it's like almost broaden that a little bit and say like, okay, well, I can be the chef. I can be a chef de cuisine at a place, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this one. Or to the entrepreneurship thing, it's like, it's almost like you get to a place where you cannot continue to grow at that organization. That happened at the last restaurant that I was working at, right? Where it was like, there was no role for me to get promoted higher then, right? Like, I was a sous chef leading the pass, doing all the expediting, helping to, recurate the tasting menu every 3 months. And the person above me was the chef owner. It was like, there was no, like we had talks of like opening another restaurant and I could be the head chef of that concept, but it was not necessarily like I wanted to be at that restaurant. And so all of that was something where I was like, okay, the entrepreneurship thing is the next step for me. And so that was something that I had to kind of like grapple with. It was a painful transition. I realized I had skills that were lacking. All of this stuff kind of had to come to pass for me. I don't know. Did you have thoughts that like on the sacrifice thing? And it's like there's almost like a pay your dues thing angle to this that I can imagine this person subscribes to. I don't know. What were your thoughts as you read through this?
Yeah, I think the one thing I thought of is the idea of everyone's aiming. I think that gets you into a lot of trouble when you assume everyone else's goals. I've worked in restaurants where the lead grill cook had been there 17 years and got raises appropriately and was killer, and he was happy to be the lead grill cook and didn't want much more, and he was totally content because that money paid for his bills, paid for his family, and he loved what he did. And I just think that we get into a weird space where we're just assuming everyone wants the same goals we want, or everyone's gunning for the same thing. And then there's also, and this is a youth thing, I think. I remember being, there's this idea of, oh, you get frustrated because you expect perfection and everyone else doesn't, or you want it more than everyone else. And I just think that's like a really, really egotistical way of viewing your job. It's like, no, everyone's at their own spot. Like, and you can experience it and go about it however you want. But I don't think you should project onto others that want, and you shouldn't expect that on anyone, because then that's just projecting your own wants and desires onto them. And they might have a wholly happy life and not really have those needs. So I just think there's a little bit of ego there as well. Maybe an unintentional ego. And again, not a negative thing. I think it's great to be ambitious. I do think, though, that also the last thing I'll say is because someone might not want to be a chef doesn't mean you nudge them out. I think if someone's talented at what they do, but they're not looking for much more, I don't think that means they're useless or meaningless in a kitchen. I think actually, or anywhere, I think that's actually the opposite thing. So just a little bit of a, like you said, a little bit, maybe a scarcity mindset from this person commenting.
I just don't view the downside to like being the replacement angle. I mean, I guess I can empathize with, like, I'm sure there's going to be somebody in the comments who has a story of like, this happened to me. It was totally devastating. I trained somebody up. They were willing to work for less than me because I had been getting those raises over the years. And the owner operator was a total dickhead and was basically like, I'm going to, undercut you and say, you have to go for this. You know what I mean? Like, I can hypotheticalize how this might play out and actually harm somebody. But at the same time, I think that there's like, you can ask those questions. And what I would more see happening is like, oh my goodness, as an operator, now I have two really talented bakers. What am I going to do here from a sense of like, now if I want to negotiate a 4-day work week, if the business is growing and doing well and we're going to open another location or do a commissary kitchen model or something like that, I think that there's so much more opportunity if you have other people who have your skill set. Because what happens if you don't do something like that? Then all the chips fall on your shoulders. You're the only one who knows how to quote unquote make the brioche. And now all of a sudden you're feeling bad because when you get sick, you're feeling all this guilt because nobody else can quote unquote do it as well as you can. I just think from a mindset perspective, I've had too much like indoctrination from like reading the E-Myth Revisited, like going through all of these delegation frameworks that I've had to teach myself in business to kind of like not make myself the single point of failure, that I just don't approach work in this way. And I am just so pro teaching stuff and making rising tide lifts all boats. Obviously, skill development is something I'm super, super crazy passionate about, to the point of like it's becoming a meme on the show. But I think that's why I preach this stuff, because I think it's important to do. And if you're going to say this stuff and then also complain that when you have a day off, the bread isn't as good, that's kind of on you, dude.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. I have a piece from a publication I hadn't, stumbled upon yet. It's called Vittles. It's called Vittles Magazine. I think it's a publication out of the UK. They interviewed a gentleman named Andy Haler. Those that have been in the like fine dining and Michelin world, that name probably rings a bell. He is the person who I'm almost positive became the first person to have eaten at every 3 Michelin star restaurant in the world. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong here, Ray, or somebody in the comments. Like, I'm almost positive he also had some like controversy lately in both his writing and his approach to criticism that, again, we can hash it out in the comments. But Vittles interviewed him because Michelin was kind of going to repost and reevaluate stars for Great Britain, Ireland, and Dublin specifically. No, in Ireland, in Dublin on Monday. And so they basically interviewed him and were kind of like talking about Michelin. Can you trust Michelin? It is a paid post on their Substack, I'm almost positive. But I did just kind of want to go through some points that they did share as kind of like a preview to the article. And if there's any talking points that we can go over, I wanted to jam on those. So the question that was posed to Andy was, quote, I want to start by asking, how can a Michelin star restaurant be bad? I'm not going to read his whole response here, but just some quotes that stood out here. Quote, unfortunately, that's a very common issue in chefing these days because everyone's frantically trying to be innovative. But most of the really good combinations were discovered 100 or 500 years ago. I can actually remember a 3-star dish at a place in Marseille, a dessert involving blueberries and coriander or something. It was absolutely disgusting, inedible. The third issue is execution. Can they actually cook the things? You would hope in a Michelin-starred restaurant you'd be looking at capable chefs. But a good example of that not being the case was at a 2-starred place in Schlossberg in the Black Forest, very near to a place of 3-star restaurants, which are both excellent. There was a whole mass of issues with bad ingredients, technical and design issues, and things were wildly oversalted. One dish of trout, spetzel, and an undefined sauce was so grotesquely salty that neither of us could eat it, end quote. And that really stood out to me as like, these are still people-run, prone to mistakes environments that we see as, sometimes they're super intimidating. Oh my goodness, the standards are so high at these places. But at the same time, Andy, somebody who has like this wide, robust list of experiences at some of these restaurants, says it sometimes misses the mark. And so that's something where I think when you and I, Ray, have comments that come through when somebody just had a bad experience at a Michelin kitchen, it almost like they discount the whole kit and caboodle. They throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and they say, Michelin cannot be trusted anymore. I can't believe this is a 2 Michelin star restaurant. Because can you believe that they had this award and this accolade and I just had this experience? I'm not saying, and I think I've made this clear in other pieces of content before, that mistakes don't happen in these environments. I think you kind of have to look at it probabilistically and say, like, what can we do? I have a whole problem-solving module of Total Station Domination where I talk about this, to like decrease the chances that something like this is going to happen in our kitchen, in the dining room, to a guest. And that's kind of the game, because aside from, you making 2 of everything and having a sous chef sit there and like individually taste every single thing that goes across the pass every night, it turns into something where we just talked about examples of service maybe not going so well. This is an example of food being oversalted in an instance. I think this is something that a lot of people can maybe empathize with. I've certainly had experiences, and I share these in the going out to eat videos that I post, where a dish just lands flat. And it's maybe not a developmental problem from the sense of like the dish was bad. It's like an execution problem on that pickup. The dish was maybe not prepared so well. And so I just thought it was an interesting point that this was getting called out so explicitly. I don't know if
I want to share a point on that. Yeah. I don't know if I'm famous for saying in the podcast, but I'm famous for saying that Boca in Chicago is one of my favorite restaurants because I feel that there's nothing that really blows your mind, but they cook at such a high level. And that every time I've dined there, their meal, which is, I think, fairly priced in the Michelin standards, is cooked at just an extremely technical level. What's funny is I was chatting with someone who had been at Boca, and I want to start by saying I don't think this opinion is wrong, but this is someone that isn't really like in the chef space. They said, it was good, but it didn't blow me away. I was expecting a little bit more out of a Michelin star restaurant. And I think Michelin culture in the United States over the last few years has been dominated by the Alinea and the EMPs and all of that. And it was just funny because knowing a deeper level of cooking, I felt like for the first time, and this sounds pretentious saying this, but maybe I appreciated the technique on display because I actually knew the technique. Whereas this person was expecting something totally different, like a mind-blowing experience in terms of experience and menu crossover and whatnot. And while they have beautifully crafted dishes, it's not like blowing your mind. Like I ate at Enigma in Spain, and that blew my mind because of the different ways they did stuff. And so it was just funny to me that I could appreciate them on a level of technicality, but that was also due to my experience as a chef and as a cook in the food industry. And that maybe that's lost on many people because while you might go, oh, this dish tastes really good, you also go, but like, I wanted it to blow me away. And so it's just interesting. And again, it wasn't a wrong opinion. It was just, wow. And so I look at the Michelin guide and maybe it's a part of that, or it's that taking it to the next level. Like for me, the technicality that they show it's masterful. And so I kind of understand this in a sense where maybe if you put forward blowing people's mind or trying a bunch of crazy things over just really technical food, you might get rewarded on a Michelin level and at an everyday person level. But if someone really knows food and they kind of doesn't work, you might get scolded in the back end. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. In line with this, I know that I've been like teasing that I'm making a Michelin deep dive episode, and part of the reason why it's like both been stalled is because we've been making other content, but then also I'm grappling with this exact idea. This like Michelin is this arbiter of quality. They tell people what's good and what's not. But then at the same time, because these restaurants have all of these variables at play, it doesn't mean just because a 3 Michelin star restaurant is able to deliver XYZ experience for that inspector that qualifies them for achieving this award and this accolade. Does that mean that the guest on table 34 is going to have a quote unquote 3 Michelin star experience that is like, they are intentionally like ambiguous with how they talk about their qualities? And then what if the menu is different? And then also, what is the state of that person going into the experience? All very, very interesting questions. I don't necessarily have a clear answer. There's another question that kind of touches on this in the piece where the interviewer asks, what about Michelin's own principles and methodologies? Do you think that within Michelin's own awarding criteria that there are things that are bad or too prescriptive? And what is the effect on restaurants attempting to subscribe to those criteria? And Andy says, quote, the criteria are not unreasonable. Ingredient quality, the technical skill of the chef, and consistency. Another consideration is the personality of the chef in the food, which I've never fully understood, but I presume is to do with the originality or inventiveness of something. You can't really argue with ingredient quality or technical skill. Consistency is interesting because there have been quite a few exposés to show that Michelin very rarely re-inspects the same restaurant in the same year. And then he says in Pascal Remy's book, where he talks about the life of a Michelin inspector, he reveals that there were only at that time in 2004 about 5 inspectors for the whole country of France, end quote. And that I think is counter to what we're seeing with Michelin having this big reinvestment play, and they're charging so much for these, metropolitan areas or the whole state or this whole region to kind of pay for these guides to come to the city. I can imagine it's to like counteract some of this stuff. It's like so that we can pay for more inspectors so that we can go to visit places more frequently. And have you ever read this book, Ray, The Zen and Art of Motorcycle Maintenance?
Yeah.
It's a very interesting book. It's kind of like weird and quirky, and it's written in this very, like non-stereotypical way. But that book basically explores this idea of quality. It does a bunch of other rants, and it explores it through this idea of going on a road trip and fixing your motorcycle along the way. But the author frequently comes back to this idea of like quality and craft and workmanship. And he's basically grappling with the idea of how to define quality throughout the entire book. And those who have read it kind of understand what I'm talking about. those who maybe haven't, we'll link it in the description if it would be interesting for you to read. And basically, it's like an unsatisfying conclusion that they land on of like, how do you define quality in something? And it's worth kind of like pondering that for yourself as you're met with some of these quality, criteria. Maybe that's a better word to use here. When it's like, we're using things like ingredient quality, we're using things like technical skill, we're using things like consistency. And it's like, what would that actually look like? I love the question of how do you operationalize this? In other words, how do you basically guarantee behaviors to happen in any of these environments? And after you sit and ask yourself this question and again, just ponder the as an exercise, you realize it's really hard. And so it almost kind of like puts you on a better footing to almost put Michelin in this, like, you're not necessarily making them these total arbiters of truth. Everything that they say is like gospel and we need to like worship at their feet here. But then at the same time, you also grapple with like Ray, you and I think have talked about like other people trying to launch alternatives to the Michelin Guide. And it's really freaking hard. And so this is one of the reasons why that's the case. We're going to link the full piece in the show notes, but it was just something that in this train of thought that I've been on, I thought it was an interesting thing that I just wanted to kind of bring up if that sparks anything for you as a listener. What else you got?
I think we should do the fine dining quick hits and end on the video reaction. We got 17 minutes.
Okay, cool. So the first one is 2 openings that I think we've either been touching on or that we brought up or came across the radar from the sense of it's a fine dining place, it's a tasting menu spot, and there's just interesting things operationally that they're doing that I wanted to call out. So the first one is a restaurant called Vicinity in Los Gatos, which is famously the place where Manresa, David Kinch's went on to earn 3 Michelin star restaurant that is now closed is. And so that from a like Bay Area, you know what I mean? I know it's not quite in San Francisco or Oakland or, you know, even going north to like Napa. That is just a new place. And the chef is Julian Silvera. And he has experience, I'm almost positive, in Florida, where he got a restaurant a Michelin star, and now he's in California, kind of like doing foraging stuff. It's 13 courses on the tasting menu, $195 per person, and then they have supplemental courses. So it's not, you know, like crazy exorbitant on the level of like a Enclose, which we've kind of covered on the show. But I just kind of wanted to bring it up as a place that, again, have not really seen the food, but it was something that kind of came up in my research as I was looking through new places.
I do like I do want to just say the details page. Also, 13 courses, $195 is pretty fair, I would say.
Yep.
It says every course reflects a moment or point in time from Silvera's own life: a hike, a fishing trip, a day spent touring a foreign city. Each dish a memory translated to the plate through flavor and form. I definitely am interested in seeing that menu, so that'd be interesting.
And the next one is Liel in LA. We covered that as Marcus Jernmark, famously chef de cuisine of Franzen in Stockholm. He came to LA, was doing this project called Habitu, which was basically like a pop-up private table you could book for like it was over $10,000, I'm almost positive. Not per person, but like he would basically sell it as a table of 10 or something like that. And it was like they were aging their own caviar, curing and aging their own caviar. They were dry aging fish and meat. He partnered with Robert Sandberg, I'm almost positive, who is also a sous chef at Franzen. And they basically collaborated to do this in LA as this kind of like roving pop-up concept thing. And then it was announced that he was not only going to open Liel, but he was also going to open another restaurant that I'm almost positive is a little more casual. The thing that I wanted to touch on with Liel specifically is on the menu page, Ray. If you look at the menu, which is $150, they only have 4 examples, which I don't know if that's like the exact example, but they're toggles, and you can toggle them open, which almost to the point on the spiel thing, it almost gives it's like 2 paragraphs long on each of the dishes.
Yeah.
And so as an example, abalone barbecue, seaweed rice, Brussels sprouts, fermented head of the wood sauce. And when you toggle that open, it's almost like what ideally I can imagine Chef Marcus would talk about if he were tableside spieling this to you. As an exercise, I think this is incredibly valuable for chefs to do. If you're sitting here and you're saying, I want to get better at talking about food, look at this as an example and then say, can I do this with the food that I'm serving? And if not, like, that's an interesting place to sit with and like grapple with that and say, because I think he really beautifully weaves like this. There's a storytelling aspect here. There's a beverage pairing thing here that I can imagine is really good at like upselling people to wine. There's like a real intentionality behind why each ingredient was chosen here. I'll just read really quickly the abalone.
It's a first-person narrative too, as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so it says, quote, "The abalone is gently pounded and then grilled over white oak charcoal while the liver is simmered in a seaweed broth and blended into a paste made with the remaining kelp from the toasted nori and dashi sauce, seasoning the grilled abalone perfectly while the rice is steamed and seasoned with a sweet vinegar, infused with 3 types of local seaweed to bring out the clean flavors. The Brussels sprouts are fried to get that deep earthiness. The koji and mushroom fermentation are enriched with butter and generously drizzled around the plate. Did I hear butter? Yes, chef. While the Soms may defaults to white burgundy, consider some alternative routes. Rajat Parr's incredible Chardonnay Sauvignon blend from Filon Farm hits all the right notes with a rich, buttery texture and refreshing acidity, complemented by savory flavors that pair beautifully with the fermented mushroom sauce. For an old world option, consider a classic white Rioja to complement this umami-packed dish." Like, in and of itself, that almost primes you to kind of like open yourself up to having that type of experience at the restaurant, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know, like if this is something where you're just like totally nervous to sit here, or you're kind of like, am I going to get, do these people know their stuff? There's an incredible amount of like being able to walk the walk and talk the talk, so to speak. We care about our purveyors. We care about our suppliers. Like, there's intentionality behind our food. Put that on your website. Like, include that in your marketing. Like, try to tell that story before the guest sits at the table or the counter. I can imagine that would go a long way. I've had friends eat here and say it's an incredible experience and it's a very high quality execution of what they're trying to do. And so on my next trip to LA, this is absolutely going to be on the list. And I just wanted to cover it as both an opening, if it's an opportunity for you career-wise, but then also conceptually how they're marketing the thing and listing their menu. I just think it's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Lastly, 2 quick hits as promised. Before we get into the 11 Madison Park piece, New Orleans is going to be where the World's 50 Best North America Awards happen. That's going to be on May 28th. And so we have yet to hear kind of like through the grapevine any sort of like movers or shakers that are going to be on that list. Yeah, Emeralds for sure. I think EJ has been getting a ton of love on various publications and, media opportunities. I think it's awesome that both 2 Michelin stars has been awarded, but then there's also like, they're leveraging it. You know what I mean? Like they're leaning in and they're trying to, I can imagine that it's been a boom for business for them.
I'll clip it. I'm going to predict that Emeralds makes World's 50 Best list. We can clip this and say it right later.
Heck yeah. Let's do it. Okay. Last, we're going to show a video here really quick on the Infatuation. A critic from New York went to eat at 11 Madison Park. Obviously, Ray and I have not made it there yet. And a rating of 6.2 out of 10 was given. And so let's play that video really quick for you folks.
And as you pull that up, I'll just say we both have our opinions. We haven't discussed them. So we may agree, we may disagree. So we'll see.
Okay, can you hear me?
Side quest, 11 Madison Park is serving meat again. I recently returned and respectfully, I'm not sure they're trying anymore. When the fine dining restaurant ditched meat in 2021, I wasn't in love with the food, but I appreciated what they were trying to do. It was an experiment. They were making a statement. Last year, when I heard they were bringing meat back, I was confused. It seemed like a surrender, but at the same time, the critic in me thought the meal will probably be a lot better. The critic in me was wrong. First off, the current menu, still $365, feels substantially similar to the plant-based version. It offers different riffs on radish and tonberry seeds, but it's roughly the same quality, which is to say interesting and boundary-pushing, but ultimately skimpy and kind of a drag if you aren't all in on vegetables. The only real difference is that now, if you choose, you can swap 3 of your plant-based courses for ones involving meat or fish. Instead of silken tofu with curry oil, for example, you can get poached lobster, or instead of a tardivos salad, which is good but questionable in the fine dining context, you can get some scallops folded into pockets of crisp radish. I will say, the meat dishes are more effortlessly compelling than their vegetarian counterparts, most of which seem like they are suffering from an inferiority complex that results in an overcompensating amount of salt. But what's the point in eating meat here? It's not like those dishes, like the signature honey lavender duck, are all that interesting or even purely delicious. The meat feels like a band-aid, a quick fix. At least the plant-based menu had a point of view. Isn't that what you want from fine dining? Now, as incredibly thoughtful as the service is, the experience feels generic. When an al dente potato is presented in a custom ceramic steamer, it feels goofy in a way that becomes less endearing when the next table over is eating duck. When, in terms of restaurant prices, you reach the 99.9th percentile, the stakes are huge, and this place still doesn't cut it, even less so now. I don't know what the solution is for 11 Madison Park, but I don't think this was it. Hit the link in bio to read our full review. After
Okay, let's talk about this review. I have a couple thoughts as well. So first thing that came up for me was how New York looked, and still probably, I can imagine, operates under this like 11 Madison Park, Jean-Georges, Danielle, per se type of, you know what I mean? Those are the heavy at the top
Le Bernardin
type of places. Le Bernardin, great call out. That it's almost like lobster prepared in that way. If you were watching the video and in context is literally just like the tail brushed with like butter, or I can imagine there was other things that were maybe infused with that. And then it's like the small vegetable garnish and then the sauce poured tableside. Or the duck, as an example. Like crusted duck has kind of like swept through both New York and LA. Like they're in a world where Daniel Hume is not the only person, he didn't like pioneer this, but like from a consistently getting really high quality Hudson Valley, you know, like duck, I can imagine is what they're serving. It is like that was almost like an exclusive opportunity to enjoy this. And when everybody and their brother now is serving butter poached lobster and duck in that way, you were going to go to have that experience and you're going to say, well, why am I paying $365 for this thing that I can go down the street and get for $175 at a 1 Michelin star or 2 Michelin star place? And that gap is typically made up by the level of service that you're going to experience. And without having been to 11 Madison Park since Will Guidara left, I don't know what the service quality is at 11 Madison Park. And so that is something that I certainly like in friends who have sent me this review and just kind of like you folks have, you know, DM'd and said, hey, please, you know, respond or react to this on the podcast. It is something that like I kind of mentioned, this is what they do best, so to speak. I think the problem is that was what they did best in, you know what I mean, 2018, so to speak, when they were quote unquote the only place in town. They hadn't had a gajillion people come through the kitchen, learn how to do that technique, and then they go be a sous chef at another place and they say, hey, do you want the recipe from the duck from 11 Madison Park? Like, we can do that. And then it turns into something where it's almost watered down. It's saturated, to flip the other, you know, the analogy the other way. And it's like, now you're in a market where everybody kind of like expects some of this stuff and it doesn't hold as much value anymore. And then the other one was like, I'm surprised to hear the pushback on, like, didn't we want a lot of the plant-based stuff to stay? Like, I was just so, you know, taken aback to hear that, like, it's bad that some of the plant-based stuff is still on the menu. And maybe that's the place where it breaks, is that when you put it in contrast with meat and seafood, it doesn't hold as much weight, and it needed, in order for this to function in the way that it needs to and land with guests, it needs to just be the only option. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think I predicted, and if I'm wrong, you can let me know in the comments, that this would be a very poor brand decision for 11 Madison Park. The whole reason why they were lauded going plant-based is because it was something that was, like he said, a courageous act, a fine dining act. I have a couple of points. First of all, I've ordered plant-based menus at restaurants before because I believe that you see more creativity, albeit also more risk, when a chef goes totally plant-based because you don't have protein to rely on. And so I think that's a very, like, that, I think that's what the testament to a chef can be. Two, the idea that, again, it was just such a weird framework for me because in my mind, just putting the lobster tail that's basic or the duck that's just a slice of it is more boring and less value, in my opinion, than the beautifully crafted plant-based dishes. Because I can go get that anywhere. But I can't go get EMP's interpretation of a radish or a type of salad somewhere, because that's the creativity part of it. So it just does feel like a reliance back on meat, or trying to put meat back on the menu to appease people. So I think what EMP has done is they've confused the brand. They kind of taken away because you have the people that wanted to go there for a great experience, and then you inevitably get the people that want to meet, but then you get this idea of where they're maybe not doing both as good anymore because they become conflicted, and now their brand's all confused. And I don't know. I don't know that it's weird to elevate a potato to that level if it tastes delicious. We are all going to have the naysayers that say that, and I'm not saying that they should be defended for these issues. I'm just simply saying I think what they were doing was great. I think they took their brand in a new direction, and I think that they've kind of torn that down, and now they just live in this weird zone of you're appeasing business people in New York City, and you're not really inspiring much else, and it's hard to say without eating there, but that's the tone that I've picked up. But I did think they were going to suffer from image and brand perspective because they've totally done a 180, and then I didn't realize that the plant-based menu was mostly there still. I thought they were going fully back to embrace meat. It just is very odd. So I think that it was a little bit. I didn't really agree with that point of this is I would rather try the vegetables. And again, you're paying that money for the art of it all. At the end of the day, if you're going there, and this is the last thing I'll say, this is such a societal piece. As more and more people look at value, fine dining is an art. It's a expensive concert. It's going to a live sports event. I don't know how much value you can glean from a place like EMP. You're not going there to get a value of a ton of food. You're going there for the expression of food as art. You should leave full, obviously. But again, that value piece contradicts the entire philosophy of what a restaurant like EMP is, for better or worse. So those are my feedback points.
My hope is that they can take this and obviously appease, quote unquote, the people who are like, I just want the lobster and the duck back on the menu. And then they can basically take some sort of insight or innovation push. I know that we had also covered one of the people who was on the culinary development. I can't remember exactly what his role was, but right before this announcement happened, he left the restaurant. And so it's kind of if you don't have anybody who's experienced doing R&D, it's how do you quote unquote innovate if that's not something that's being prioritized in the organization? I can imagine with some of this feedback coming out, and Infatuation is just one publication or media outlet. We're not necessarily saying this is a definitive 11 Madison Park is going down the tubes. I think there's also potentially an opportunity here for, I can't believe I didn't bring this up in the episode, Ray, but that's what we did at the French Laundry. There was the chef's tasting menu and a tasting of vegetables on purpose, because it was if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, one, operationally, and it was incredibly easy for us to basically accommodate the dietary restriction. But then it was also from a values and concept perspective, it really just put into example what we were capable of living right across the street from the garden. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then it was if you want the Parmesan cheese and the Wagyu and the oysters and the caviar, it's that's on the chef's tasting menu. And so all of that stuff just put into, and they were the same price, I'm almost positive. And so all of that put into context, it's there's a way to do this well. I just think that, and they could have done this, but I think that would have put them, maybe too much in competition with per se. I don't know. It's just very, very interesting. That's where we're going to wrap today. I hope that this has been we covered a lot of stuff today. If there's thoughts that you folks have or comments, please let us know in the comments. Like and subscribe, and we will see you folks next week. Thanks for listening.